Hey guys, JP here, talking about marketing trends. So, marketers are faced with an increasingly growing challenge of getting the attention span of the consumer and figuring out how to get the message out there when the consumer is actively trying to figure out how to avoid receiving the message. So if you think about that, we used to have things like commercials that we watched on television, which we can now avoid with subscription services. People used to call us on the phone and try and set an appointment with the banker or something like that. But now we just don't answer the phone if we don't know who's on the other end. And then, online we can block pop-ups, we can avoid banners, we can use websites that maybe aren't going to constantly be streaming content at us as much. Our attention span is short, but the advertiser is still going to figure out a way to evolve and get their message across. So how do we overcome that? Well, marketers have come up with something called native advertising. I hadn't heard of it until I started this class, but essentially, if you think about advertising as kind of covert and undercover and slipping in with things that you're already looking to as sort of sources of information. So maybe it's a blog, maybe it's your social media feed, maybe it's the New York Times. All of these different things are going to have, subtle advertising content that isn't saying, hey, buy Nike, but instead it's talking about the effects of different types of running gear on your body long term. And then maybe there's a subtle link to Nike at the bottom and a logo somewhere showing that they're endorsing the content. So how about some better definitions of native advertising? So Lee and Ham in their research said that it's any paid advertising that takes the specific form and appearance of editorial content from the publisher itself. Some fancier definitions include Jordan Bitterman, who is the CSO of Mindshare, and he says that it's not interruptive, it blends into the content, and it occurs in stream. A really pretty one from Stephanie Hale. She is part of content strategy at Leo Burnett. She says that it's the artistry that occurs when distinct brands with similar attributes come together to create an experience that enriches a brand's story. So much so that people feel compelled to share it with their community.
Corporations that want to advertise, we will camouflage your ads to make them look like news stories. That's essentially it.
That's essentially it. Are you saying that to sum up your point on native advertising, or are you describing independent journalism? That's essentially it. It's over. We're done here.
Forms of native advertising would look something like this. This would be an example of a good one. The New York Times, you can see how it clearly says it's a paid post, but it's obviously sponsored by Netflix and their popular show Orange is the New Black. It is quality content and people share it because they find it useful. Now, a poor example kind of goes down in history. The Atlantic, they had an advertisement for the Church of Scientology. It was placed as a native ad and created quite a controversy. And so, as you can see, this was back in 2013, and they had to literally say that they screwed up. So that being said, can show some of the dangers of this type of advertising. So ultimately, everyone wants to know, does it work? Well, I think it does. Really, this concept kind of started in 2011, and by 2018, it's projected to be about a $21 billion industry within marketing. So I'd say yes. Research shows that it's most effective when it's not intrusive. So we don't want to feel like our content is being disrupted. We just want it to kind of blend in naturally. So the more effective that is, the more effective the advertising will be. Additionally, people don't want to feel like they're getting sold, so they're more inclined to accept the information if it corresponds with something that they're seeking. So if I'm out there researching something, maybe I want to make a purchase, then if this content were to match with what I was looking for, I'd be more inclined to accept it. I'd also be more inclined to believe it and to share it with people in my social media streams and things like that. So does it always work? No, it does not. Typically when it doesn't work is when people feel like they're being manipulated, when it is disruptive, And I would just say anything that seems misleading. If people catch on to the fact that this is being so covert, it kind of works against us. So, how do people know if it's journalism or if it's advertising? I think the secret here is the best native advertising. They won't know. They'll assume what it is. They'll assume that it is what they want it to be. So research does show that education level really impacts people's ability to identify the difference between advertising and some sort of true journalistic article, but it's becoming increasingly difficult because Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Atlantic, they've all been forced in order to gain revenue that they desperately need to stay in business, they have to use this type of advertising, even though maybe at first they didn't want to adopt the strategy. So what are the potential implications for the advertiser? Well, some would just say, is it even ethical? Most of the research that I did on the subject came down to the double-edged sword of, kind of being forced to go down this route, but is it really ethical because you're misleading your intended audience? It is intentionally deceptive, so I see the argument, but I also understand, if users don't want to be overtly marketed to, then, marketers have to figure out how to get their message well received, and maybe this is the way that that's done. I think the other question for a marketer is, if I'm using this as a strategy, is it even going to work? Just like any marketing strategy, we want it to be effective. What I saw in my research is that you certainly want to make sure that the content makes sense for the stream that you are using. So if the two aren't innately aligned, then the user is going to read it and feel like it's out of place. And so that's definitely not going to be effective for you. And then we really want to make sure that the analytics continue to support the effectiveness. So when you're using a lot of online media, you can track things like how often content's being viewed or shared. So that can really help the marketer figure out if their advertising is effective. So what about you, the consumer? How do you protect yourself? Well, I do think one of the dangers is that in the historical past, there were these things called advertorials that were kind of similar, but they were more overt. It was specifically, you could tell it was selling a product. And now that's just not the case. So from a research perspective, it becomes interesting because you now have places like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Atlantic, like I previously mentioned, that could effectively be used as primary sources in the past that may not be effective primary sources just because they're from a publisher doesn't mean that they're going to be a strong, solid source for you for research. So we have to be able to educate students how to discern the difference between paid content and unpaid content. And then ultimately, we can't ever believe everything that we read, whether it's supposed to be journalistic or if it's potentially advertisement. So I think as a consumer, you just have to be your own best advocate. Don't use one source for everything. And as an advertiser, try not to be so subtle that you get a reputation for misleading the consumer.